So, one thing that I wanted to briefly discuss was the nature and evolution of Moe. Now, Moe is a very interesting topic. It's very divisive, and in terms of an academic definition, there is really a lacking there. And if you were to take a Galbrathian look at Moe, you would get this very different idea than if you took a look that I would be taking. See, the perspective that I take is not so much of that of the interaction as Moe, though I do see the necessitation of that terminology, but rather I look at the identity of Moe, and this is where things kind of begin to get strange. See, Moe is a combination of aesthetic ideologies and characterization traits. And realistically, you could trace Moe back to the first growth of character. See, fundamentally, when we're observing Moe, we have these characters that interact with their world in a progressively changing manner. They're evolving. It's literally derived from the term moru, meaning to bud. And so this growth in the flame of these characters can be representative or rather be utilized in order to build new relationships within not only the text itself, but within the metatext. And so within these metatextual elements, the interaction of the viewer is where we derive the Galbrathian view of Moe from. But in reality, we want to observe this entirely different Moe, the aesthetic, the identitarian. And this identity can really be traced back to some 1970s anime with some rather prominent female characters. And while that existed there, the real birth of Moe as a movement, the real point at which it began to evolve into something more interesting, was at the turn of the decade of the 1980s. Now, of course, this turn of the decade of the 1980s isn't just linked to the growth in Moe, but rather the growth in otaku and the division between the otaku and the common. See, the idea that gets represented here is that once the 1980s kind of started, there was a string of murders known as the Otaku murders or the Miyazaki murders, all depending upon where you see things reported. And this had created a general disdain that the public had for the otaku, for those heavily dedicated people into anime and manga, less so for manga, primarily for anime. And so within this division that we see the interaction side of Moe once again arising. But really around this time, at the very first responses to Moe, we could see things like the Mobile Suit Gundam film trilogy, in which it was documented that people had snuck cameras into it and they would take screenshots of the film in a very primitive way and they would trade them in these circles. And I always find that hilarious because Yoshiyuki Tomino never intended for anything of that scale to happen with his female characters. We then get to see these forms of female protagonists intertwined into later Japanese media, and I think that one of the first really great examples of this would kind of be Adachi Mitsuru's Touch. Like in the anime and manga, there is a slew of different forms of female characters that are interacted with over the course of the series, and in this we get kind of a really interesting formative period for Moe. And I think that this is really one of the best places to look if you want to observe how the Moe in Evangelion came out and how really in a post-Evangelion landscape there was this Moe boom. So within Touch, we have characters like Asukara Minami, who would then go on to form character archetypes such as the tsundere, and we have a character that is a lower classman to the primary characters. And this this lower classman would then go on to really be echoed in terms of a design ideology in Kakiyuse from 1999, which is a readaptation of the 1994 OVA. And so within this, we see once again this division that occurs. And I mean, we can also trace the roots of the kudere to something like the Uchiyama Aki trilogy of OVAs, especially if we're observing something like Uchiyama Aki's milk drinking doll. And so basically from there, we splinter through to the mid 90s with a pretty consistent string of this type of moe. We don't see much evolution in the form. And once we hit the mid 90s, we see the response overwhelmingly take over from the identity. See, the moe identity at the point of the mid 90s kind of burst open, where, you know, with Evangelion coming onto the scene and shaking everything up, we then had this slew of just unstoppable moe vomit, if you will, where, you know, series like Kakiyuse from 1999 and you know, many of the early key adaptations were happening in the early 2000s. And things were consistently going along, and then eventually we reached, you know, 2006 or 7, and we get The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which, you know, once again kind of caused an otaku burst. And then we go 2 years forward, and we see a division once again occur from just moe, and we see moe and ecchi interact in something like Bakemonogatari, where we see this kind of division within the series' own context that allows us to, in the future, observe a more advanced kind of interaction in these forms, which would then go on to kind of lead us into something like Infinite Stratos from 2011, I believe. And so then we continue on, and eventually we reach our current landscape in which the interaction of moe and ecchi is very compelling, because we have these two very distinct groupings. We have, you know, these moe series directed by Yamada Naoko, and then we have these ecchi series directed by Who Even Cares. And then in between, we have these series that focus upon creating interactable characters, but also attempt to sexualize them in an intense form. And that's where one of the most compelling facets of today's moe comes from. Anyway, I don't have any real conclusions to reach with this. I just thought that it was an interesting little experiment to take a look at, because I've been watching Touch and I've been going through and just randomly watching every anime of all time, you know. So if you found this interesting, leave a like, leave a comment. I'll probably answer all the questions that are asked in the comment section. And consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, check out my podcast. I do more of this kind of stuff, but in a very different interaction-based way. Thanks.